Welcome back. We think we know what time is, but for most of history, it didn't really exist. Right now, your phone is counting every single millisecond. Back then, you just looked at the sun and hoped for the best. Things got pretty weird. People actually hired guys to shoot dried peas at their bedroom windows just to wake them up. The Romans used water clocks that leaked at specific rates to track the day. When trains first showed up, they used to literally slam into each other because every town had its own version of noon. Factory bosses even used to mess with the clock hands just to steal free labor from their workers. I'm just a guy who likes sharing these stories, so hit subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. Also, leave a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to the days before the ticking started. The first thing you have to wrap your head around is the silence. There was no ticking back then because there was nothing to tick. No gears, no batteries, and no glowing screens on a nightstand. Imagine you are out there 10,000 years ago. The sun hits your face. That is your alarm. There is no snooze button. You get up because the light is there and the world is starting to move. You look at your family and you realize you are hungry. That is your only schedule. Your stomach tells you it is time to move, so you move. Back then, people did not think about time as something you could lose. You can't lose something you don't even track. They did not have minutes or hours. If you asked a hunter-gatherer what time it was, they would probably just point at the sun. That was the only clock that mattered. Think about your typical Tuesday. You have a lunch break at noon. You pick up the kids at 3. You watch a show at 8. Now, wipe all of that away. For these people, the day was not a list of tasks. It was just a stretch of light. When the sun came up, the work started. But it was not the kind of work we know today. There were no bosses and no spreadsheets. You just looked at the people around you and knew they needed to eat, so you went looking for food. Maybe you walked for miles following a set of tracks. Maybe you sat by a bush and picked berries for half the day. But you did not call it 4 hours of labor. You just did it until the basket was full, or the sun got too hot to handle. The heat dictated everything. In the middle of the day, when the sun was beating down, you did not keep pushing just to meet a quota. You found a tree, you sat in the shade, you waited. You reacted to the world around you instead of trying to force the world to fit your schedule. We live in a world of sevens now. 7 days in a week, 5 days of work, 2 days of rest. But those early humans did not know what a week was. The concept would have sounded crazy to them. Why would you treat every 7th day differently? You rested when you were tired. You hunted when the animals were nearby. If a herd of deer moved past your camp on a day we would call Sunday, you did not say you were off the clock. You grabbed your spear and you ran. And if it rained for 3 days straight, you did not stress about lost productivity. You stayed in your shelter and you told stories. You waited for the rain to stop. You were on nature's time. Animals do not use watches, and back then we didn't either. We were just another part of the woods. We followed the elk and the bison. If they moved south, we moved south. We did not have a calendar telling us it was October. We just felt the air get cold. We saw the leaves change color. We saw the birds flying away, and we knew it was time to pack up. There was no such thing as being late. You got there when you got there. If you were meeting another group by a certain river, you did not say you would see them at noon on the 10th. You said you would see them when the moon was full by the big rock, and you would wait. Maybe they got there a day before you. maybe a day after. It did not matter. Nobody was checking their wrist and getting annoyed. This sounds like a vacation to us, but it was hard work. It was all about reaction. If the sun went down and you had not found food, you went to bed hungry. You could not just order food at midnight. Darkness was the end of the day, period. Once the light was gone, the world belonged to the predators. You stayed by the fire because the fire was your only protection. In the dark, you did not worry about what you had to do tomorrow. You could not plan that far ahead anyway. You did not know if it would rain or if the wind would pick up. You just lived in the right now. The past was a story you told around the fire. The future was just the next sunrise. There was a rhythm to it. Long days in the summer meant more time to gather. Short days in the winter meant more time to huddle together to stay warm. You were not fighting the seasons, you were moving with them. You never felt like you were wasting time. That is a modern fear. We feel guilty if we sit still for 20 minutes. We feel like we should be doing something productive. But for a hunter-gatherer, sitting still was part of the job. You sat still to watch the movements of a rabbit. You sat still to listen for the sound of water. Being productive just meant staying alive for one more day. Imagine the freedom in that. No Monday morning blues, no midweek slump, no counting down the minutes until 5 o'clock. You just lived. You breathed. You moved when the earth moved. But then something changed. We stopped following the animals and started trying to make the plants stay in one place. We stopped reacting to the world and started trying to control it. That's when we started needing to keep track of things. That's when the first shadows of the clock started to fall over us. It all started when we stopped moving and started planting. And once we started planting, everything changed. We couldn't just wing it anymore. When we were hunting and gathering, we followed the food. If the deer moved, we moved. If the bushes in one valley were empty, we walked over to the next one. We were flexible. But the second you put a seed in the ground, you are tied to that spot. You are officially committed. And that commitment came with a massive amount of pressure. Think about it this way. If you plant your crops too early, a late frost comes along and kills every single sprout. If you plant them too late, the summer heat burns them to a crisp before they can grow. You only get one shot at this. If you mess up the timing, you don't just have a bad year. You and your family starve. It was a high-stakes game of chicken with the weather, and humans realized pretty quickly that they needed a way to win. They needed to know exactly when the seasons were going to shift before it actually happened. So they did the only thing they could do. They looked up. The sky became the first giant instruction manual. People started noticing that the moon didn't just sit there. It changed. It grew into a big white circle. Then it shrunk down to a sliver, and then it disappeared. They realized this happened over and over again in a pattern. They started counting the days between those full moons. It gave them a rough idea of how much time was passing, but the moon is a bit of a liar when it comes to the seasons. It doesn't perfectly match up with when the ground gets warm or when the rain starts. To really get the timing right, they had to pay attention to the sun and the stars. They noticed that the sun didn't always rise in the exact same spot on the horizon. In the summer, it rose way over to one side. In the winter, it shifted to the other. They realized that if they could mark those spots, they would know exactly where they were in the year.
But you can't just remember a spot on the horizon. You need something permanent. So they started building. And they didn't build small. They went big. They found these massive slabs of rock, some of them weighing as much as 5 or 6 elephants. They didn't have trucks. They didn't have cranes. They had to drag these things across miles of dirt and grass using nothing but wooden rollers and a lot of sore muscles. Think about the effort that took. They weren't doing this for fun or because they wanted something pretty to look at. They were building a survival tool. They hauled these stones into giant circles, like the one we know as Stonehenge. They spent years, maybe decades, lining them up just right. They wanted to make sure that on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, the sun would rise and shine its light directly through a specific gap in the rocks. When that light hit that spot, it was like an alarm clock going off for the whole community. It told them, okay, this is it. This is the peak. From here on out, the days get shorter. It gave them a fixed point in a world that used to feel totally random. For the first time, they had a calendar. But this wasn't a calendar you could carry around in your pocket. It was made of tons of solid rock. It stayed exactly where it was. This is a huge shift in how humans lived. Before this, time was something that happened to you while you were moving. Now, time was a place you had to go to. If you wanted to know what time of year it was, you had to travel to the big rocks. You had to stand in that specific spot and wait for the sun to tell you the truth. This changed the way we thought about the land, too. These rock circles became the center of everything. They were the first official timekeeping stations. They kept us organized, but they also kept us stuck. You couldn't just wander off anymore because you needed to be near the stones to know when to plant and when to harvest. This was the birth of a schedule. We weren't just living in the moment anymore. We were looking months ahead, planning for a future that the rocks promised was coming. It was the first time we tried to pin time down and make it stay put. We built these heavy, permanent anchors in the ground just so we could feel like we had a little bit of control over the world. We stopped being travelers and started being keepers of the clock. And once we started keeping time, we found out that time had a way of starting to keep us. So we settled down. We stopped wandering and started building. We had farms, we had neighbors, and we had stuff to do. And when you have a lot of people living in one spot, you run into a new problem. You have to coordinate. You can't just wake up whenever you feel like it if the guy selling grain at the market packs up and leaves by noon. You need a way to tell everyone to show up at the same time. In places like Egypt and eventually Rome, they started looking at the ground. They noticed that if you stick a pole in the dirt, the shadow it throws doesn't just sit there, it moves. It grows long in the morning, shrinks down to a nub at noon, and stretches out again in the evening. This was the first real tool for time. They called it a sundial. It was basically a giant stick in the mud that told everyone where they stood in the day. But then they made a choice that still messes with our heads today. They decided that daylight should be split into 12 parts. I mean, why 12? Nobody is totally sure. Some people think it's because they counted the joints on their fingers using their thumb. Whatever the reason, they took the time between sunrise and sunset and chopped it into 12 pieces. They called these pieces hours. Now, this is where it gets weird. They didn't have a fixed minute like we do. They didn't have a little vibrating crystal or a battery to keep everything steady. They just had the sun. And as you know, the sun is a bit of a moving target. In the middle of summer, the sun stays up for a long, long time. In the winter, it's barely there before it ducks back down. But the rule stayed the same. Daylight is 12 hours, period. Think about what that actually did to a normal day. In the peak of summer, when the sun was high and the days were long, an hour was huge. If we measured it with our modern watches, a summer hour back then was about 75 minutes long. Imagine being a laborer out in a field in ancient Rome. You're hot, you're tired, and you're waiting for the 6th hour so you can take a break. But because it's July, that hour just stretches on and on. It's like the clock is moving through molasses. You're working way longer than you would in the fall, just because the sun decided to hang around. Then winter rolls around. The sun pops up late and goes to bed early. But you still have to divide that tiny bit of light into 12 chunks. Suddenly, an hour is only 45 minutes long. You're trying to get your trading done at the market. You're trying to get your chores finished, and the day is just sprinting away from you. The hour is literally shorter. Time was like a piece of giant rubber. It stretched in the heat, and it shrunk in the cold. People just accepted this. It was how life worked. They didn't need time to be precise. They just needed it to be shared. If the judge in a Roman court said your trial started at the 3rd hour, you knew roughly when to show up, even if that 3rd hour happened at a different time than it did a month ago. But then, people started wanting to track time when the sun wasn't out.
You can't use a sundial at night, and you can't use it on a cloudy day. This was a big issue for the Romans, especially in their law courts. They needed to make sure lawyers didn't talk forever. So they built water clocks. A water clock was basically a big jar with a tiny hole at the bottom. You fill it up, and the water drips out at a steady rate. There are marks on the inside of the jar, and as the water level drops past a mark, you know an hour has passed. Simple, right? But remember, they still wanted those stretchy hours. They didn't want the water clock to tell a different story than the sun. So they got incredibly clever and honestly a bit obsessive. They built these complicated valves. They had different jars for different months of the year. They would literally change the speed of the water drips every few weeks. They'd slow the water down in the summer, so the hour would last 75 minutes. Then they'd speed it up in the winter, so the water drained out in 45 minutes. They went to all this trouble just to make sure their machines matched the weird, changing rhythm of the seasons. It sounds like a headache to us. We live in a world where a second is a second, no matter what. If your phone told you that an hour was longer today because it's sunny out, you'd think it was broken. You'd probably throw it at a wall. But for these people, it was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't think of time as something that lived inside a machine. They thought of time as something that lived in the sky. The result was a life that felt a lot more flexible. You didn't feel like you were losing time, because time itself was changing with you. If you were having a long lunch with friends in the summer, you had plenty of time, because the hours were wide and lazy. You weren't constantly checking your wrist and worrying about being 5 minutes late to a meeting. You just moved with the shadows. But the seeds were planted. We had started to slice the day into boxes. Even if those boxes were different sizes, we were starting to live by the marks on a jar or the lines on a stone. We were no longer just living, we were measuring. And once you start measuring your life, you start noticing how much of it is slipping away. We were building the cage, one water drop at a time.
We just didn't realize that one day we wouldn't be able to change the speed of the drips anymore. The clock was starting to take over, and it wasn't going to stay flexible for long. So that flexibility I was talking about, it started to disappear because of a group of guys who really didn't want to oversleep. I'm talking about monks in the Middle Ages. See, if you were a monk back then, your entire life was built on a schedule that didn't care if you were tired. You had to pray at very specific times. We aren't just talking about a morning prayer and a bedtime story. These guys were getting up 7 or 8 times every single day. Some of those times happened in the dead of night when it was pitch black outside. Imagine you're one of these monks. It's 2 in the morning. It's freezing. There's no sun to look at. You can't exactly use a sundial in the dark. Water clocks were okay, but they were a pain. In the winter, the water would freeze and the clock would just stop. If the water didn't flow, you didn't know when to pray, and if you missed the prayer, you felt like you were letting down the entire universe. The pressure was huge. They needed something that worked every time, whether it was freezing cold or middle of the night dark. So they got creative. They stopped looking at water and sun and started looking at gravity. They built these massive, heavy machines made of iron and wood. I want you to picture a giant set of gears tucked away in a stone tower. To make it go, they used heavy stones tied to long ropes. They'd wind these ropes up around a wooden barrel, and then they'd let the stones hang there. Gravity wanted to pull those stones to the ground. As the stones slowly dropped, they pulled the rope, which turned the gears. It was simple physics, but it changed everything. These early machines didn't have a face. You couldn't walk up to one and see a minute hand or an hour hand. There were no numbers to look at. They didn't even call them clocks for the reason we do, because that was the whole point. The machine was there to trigger a hammer. The hammer would swing out and hit a giant metal bell. That sound would boom out across the stone walls of the monastery and wake every single person up. It was their private alarm clock. But these monasteries weren't just sitting out in the middle of nowhere by themselves. They were the centers of the community. Most towns were built right around the church. So when that giant bell rang at 3 in the morning, the monks weren't the only ones who heard it. Every farmer, every blacksmith, and every baker in the village heard it too. You're a farmer in a small hut nearby. You're fast asleep. Suddenly, this massive iron sound echoes through your walls. You aren't a monk. You don't have to go pray. But now you're awake, and you realize that everyone else is awake too. You start thinking, well, if the monks are up, maybe I should get a head start on the day. Slowly, the townspeople stopped looking at the sky and started listening to the tower. The church realized pretty quickly that they had stumbled onto something powerful. If they controlled the bell, they controlled the people. They started ringing the bell for things other than prayer. They rang it to tell people when it was time to open the market. They rang it to tell the laborers in the fields that it was time for a lunch break. They rang it to tell everyone that the workday was over and it was time to go inside and lock the doors. Think about how huge that shift is. Before this, you worked until you were tired or until it got too dark to see. You ate when you were hungry. You lived by your own internal rhythm. But now you're waiting for a machine to tell you what to do. The machine doesn't care if you're almost finished with your work. It doesn't care if you're still hungry. When the bell rings, you move. You start living your life in blocks of time decided by someone else. The church became the town's manager. They owned the schedule. If the bell didn't ring, the market didn't open. If the bell didn't ring, you didn't get a break. The people in charge realized that time was a tool for order. If you can get everyone to do the same thing at the same time, you can run a town much more efficiently. It was great for business, and it was great for the church, but the individual person lost their vote. You weren't the boss of your afternoon anymore. The bell was. These weight-driven machines were loud, they were heavy, and they were expensive, but they spread like crazy. Every town wanted one. It became a status symbol. If your town had a big bell tower with a mechanical clock, it meant you were an important place. You were organized. But the price of that organization was your freedom to just be. You couldn't just ignore the bell. It was too loud. It was everywhere. It reached into your house, into your bed, and into your fields. It forced its way into your head. For the first time in human history, we weren't just living through the day. We were being pushed through it. We were starting to march to a beat that was set by gears and falling stones. The clock wasn't just a tool anymore. It had become the boss of the street. And once the bell started ringing, there was no way to turn the volume down. We were officially on the clock, and we've been trying to keep up with it ever since.
So there we were. We had this new boss, and it was loud, and it was hanging right over our heads in the middle of town. But you have to remember, these early mechanical clocks weren't the sleek, tiny things we have today. They weren't even made by people who studied time. They were made by blacksmiths. Think about that for a second. If you wanted a clock in the 1300s, you didn't go to a specialist. You went to the guy who made horseshoes and swords. You went to the guy who spent his whole day hitting glowing red metal with a massive hammer. These first clocks were giant, heavy machines made of pure iron. They weren't delicate. They were clunky, they were noisy, and they were built to last. Or at least that was the idea. The blacksmith would take these big bars of iron and heat them up until they were soft enough to work with. He'd beat them into shape on an anvil, sparks flying everywhere, trying to make teeth for gears that were as big as dinner plates. There were no precision tools, there were no lasers. It was just a guy with a hammer trying to make a circle of metal that could catch another circle of metal. Because of that, these clocks were incredibly rough. The gears didn't fit together perfectly. They ground against each other. They screeched. They jumped. And because the parts were so heavy and the friction was so high, these machines needed huge weights to keep them moving. We're talking about massive stones or lead blocks tied to ropes. The blacksmith would wind these weights up to the top of the tower, and as the weights slowly dropped toward the ground, they pulled the gears and made the clock tick. But here is the funniest part to me. When you looked up at that first clock in the town square, you'd notice something missing. There was no minute hand. There definitely wasn't a second hand. There was just one lone pointer moving around the dial to show you what hour it was. Now, if you tried to sell a watch today that only had an hour hand, people would think you were joking. We live our lives in minutes. We freak out if we're 5 minutes late to a meeting. We count down the seconds until the microwave beeps. But back then, nobody cared about a minute. Why would they? If you were meeting a friend, you didn't say, "I'll see you at 4:15. You said, "I'll see you around the 4th hour," or "I'll see you when the sun starts to dip." Life was slow. If the clock was off by 10 or 15 minutes, it didn't change anything. You still had to milk the cows. You still had to plow the field. The sun was still going to go down when it felt like it. The hour was a big enough slice of time for anyone to worry about. Adding a minute hand would have been like adding a sensor to your car that tells you how many grains of sand are stuck in your tire. It was just useless information.
But even though they only had one hand to worry about, these clocks were a nightmare to keep running. Remember, these things were made of iron. Iron is heavy, and iron changes. When it got humid or rainy, the metal would get a little bit of rust on it. That rust created more friction, and the clock would start to slow down. When it got really hot in the summer, the iron would actually expand just a tiny bit. In the winter, it would shrink. Every single day, the environment was trying to kill the clock. The gears would get stuck. A tooth on a wheel would snap off because the blacksmith hadn't tempered the metal just right. The ropes holding those massive weights would fray and break, sending a giant stone crashing through the floorboards. Because of all this chaos, every town had to hire a specific guy just to keep the clock alive. This was the clock keeper. And let me tell you, this guy had a workout every single week. His whole job was to climb those steep, narrow stone stairs up into the bell tower. He'd get up there, covered in grease and soot, and he'd have to figure out how far off the clock had drifted. How did he do that? He couldn't check his phone. He couldn't call a friend in the next town. He had to go back to the very thing the mechanical clock was supposed to replace. He had to go out onto a balcony or look out a window at a sundial. It's kind of ironic when you think about it. Here was this high-tech machine, the peak of human engineering at the time, and it was constantly failing. To fix the modern machine, the guy had to look at a shadow on a piece of stone. The sun was still the boss. The sundial told the truth, and the mechanical clock was just a loud, heavy guesser. The clock keeper would look at where the shadow was on the sundial. Then he'd run back inside to the gears. He'd have to manually heave those iron wheels around to match the sun. He'd add a little weight or take a little off, trying to get the rhythm just right. He'd grease the teeth with animal fat to keep them from grinding. And then he'd do it all again the next week. He was constantly chasing the sun, trying to make a bunch of iron bars act like the stars. For a long time, these clocks were more like temperamental pets than reliable tools. They broke, they lied, and they needed constant attention. But even with all those mistakes and all that rust, something had changed. The sound of that bell hitting the hour meant that everyone in town was now hearing the same heartbeat. You didn't just look at the sun and guess anymore. You heard the clanging iron, and you knew exactly which hour the town decided it was. Even if the clock was wrong compared to the town 10 miles away, it didn't matter. Within those town walls, everyone started moving to the same rhythm. The blacksmith's clunky invention was starting to win. We were moving away from the natural flow of the day and into a world where a machine told us when our time was up. We didn't have minutes yet, but the hour was more than enough to start changing how we worked, how we traded, and how we lived together. We were no longer just following the light, we were following the iron. But pretty soon, that iron started to feel more like a cage. See, for a long time, we used clocks just to know where we were in the day. It was a tool. But then the 1800s rolled around, and the Industrial Revolution changed everything. Being a suggestion and started being a boss. Think about what it was like for a farmer before this. You woke up when the sun came out. If you were tired, maybe you stayed in bed an extra 20 minutes. The cows didn't care what the clock said. They just wanted to be milked when their udders were full. You worked until the light died down, and then you went inside. Your life followed the rhythm of the world. But the factory? The factory doesn't care about the sun. It doesn't care if it's raining or if you're tired. The factory only cares about the gears turning. Factory owners realized something very quickly. If they had 100 workers and 10 of them showed up late, the whole system slowed down. They were losing money every minute a machine sat idle. So they decided to get strict, really strict. This is where we get that famous saying, time is money. To these owners, your time wasn't yours anymore. You sold it to them, and they wanted every single second they paid for. Imagine you're one of these workers. You live in a tiny, cramped room in a dark city like Manchester or London. You have to be at work by 6 in the morning. Now, here is the problem. You don't own a clock. Almost nobody did back then because they were still pretty expensive. You don't have a phone with an alarm. You just have your own internal body clock, which isn't very good when you're exhausted from working 14 hours the day before. So you're walking through the foggy streets at dawn. You hear the big bell on the factory roof start to ring. That's the warning. You start to run. You can hear your boots hitting the cobblestones. You see the big wooden factory doors up ahead. And then, right as the clock hits 6, you hear it. A heavy thud. The owner or the foreman just slammed the doors shut and bolted them from the inside. If you're on the outside of that door at 6:01, you're in big trouble. In many factories, they wouldn't let you in for the rest of the morning, and because you were a minute late, the boss would dock your pay. Sometimes he'd take away half a day's wages just for that 1 minute. If you did it twice, you might lose your job entirely. People were terrified of that clock. It wasn't just a face on a wall anymore. It was a threat. Because of this fear, people had to figure out a way to wake up on time. They couldn't afford to lose half their pay. But since they couldn't afford clocks, they had to get creative. This led to one of the weirdest jobs in history. They called them knocker-uppers. I'm serious. That was a real job. A knocker-upper was basically a human alarm clock. You'd pay them a few pennies a week to come to your house before dawn. These were usually older men or women, or even off-duty police officers looking to make some extra cash. They'd walk through the streets while the rest of the city was still dead silent. Now, how do you wake someone up on the second floor of a building without waking up the whole neighborhood? You couldn't just yell or bang on the front door. So they used these long poles made of bamboo. They'd stand on the sidewalk and reach up to your bedroom window and tap, tap, tap on the glass. Some of them used pea shooters. They'd keep a pocket full of dried peas and blow them through a tube so they'd rattle against your window like hail. The rule was that the knocker-upper wouldn't leave until they saw your face at the window. You had to show them you were actually out of bed and moving. Only then would they move on to the next house on their list. It was a whole economy based on the fact that the clock was now the most important thing in your life. You were paying a person to poke your window so a factory owner didn't take your money. Eventually, the factories started making things faster and cheaper. That included clocks. Small ticking alarm clocks started showing up in shops for prices that regular people could actually pay. This was a huge turning point. Once you bought a clock and put it on your nightstand, the factory was inside your house. You didn't need the knocker-upper anymore because you had a little machine that would scream at you at 5:30 a.m. This changed how we felt about our own lives. We started measuring our worth by the numbers on the dial. Before this, if you asked someone how long a job took, they might say it took until the cows came home or until the shadows were long. Now, everything was about the minute. We stopped looking at the sky to see if it was time to eat. We looked at the clock. If the clock said 12, you were hungry, even if your stomach wasn't growling yet. That's a weird concept if you think about it. You can't be on a cloud or on a sunset, but you can be right on top of a specific number on a circle. We turned time into a destination. If you weren't there when the hand hit the mark, you were failing. The factory didn't just change how we made clothes or tools. It changed our brains. It taught us that time was something that could be sliced up into tiny little pieces and sold. It taught us that sleeping in wasn't just a rest, it was a waste of money. We began to live by the tick. Every second became a tiny heartbeat of the economy. We weren't just living through the day anymore. We were racing against it. And once that race started, we never really found a way to slow it back down. The clock was no longer just something we looked at. It was something we obeyed.
So we started obeying the clock. But here's the thing you have to understand. There were thousands of them. If you're sitting in a bar in the mid-1800s, you probably think I'm joking, but I'm not. Every single town had its own version of noon. It was actually pretty simple logic. You looked up at the sky. When the sun reached its highest point, right over your head, you called that noon. You set your town's big clock to 12, and everyone went about their business. It worked great for thousands of years. If you lived in New York, your noon was your noon. If your cousin lived in Boston, his noon was his noon. It didn't matter that your clocks didn't match because it took you 2 days on a horse to get to Boston anyway. By the time you arrived, you just reset your watch and went to bed. No big deal. But then the trains showed up, and suddenly everything broke. Imagine you're standing on a train platform in 1850. The steam engine is huffing and puffing. It's the fastest thing humans have ever built. Before this, the fastest you could go was as fast as a horse could gallop. Now you're flying across the country at 40 miles an hour. It sounds slow to us, but to them it was like a rocket ship. Here's where the math starts to hurt your brain. You get on a train in New York City at exactly noon. You travel for a few hours and get off in Boston. You look at the clock in the station and it says 12:12. You haven't been traveling for 12 minutes. You've been traveling for hours. But the town's sun time is 12 minutes ahead of the place you just left. If you keep going west to Chicago, it's even weirder. When it's noon in New York, the clocks in Chicago say 11:40. You're basically time traveling, but not in a cool science fiction way. It was more like a giant, annoying math test that never ended. And if you think it was hard for the passengers, think about the people actually running the trains. The conductors were losing their minds. Imagine you're driving a massive iron machine filled with people. You have a schedule to keep, but whose time are you using? The time of the city you started in? The time of the city you're going to? Or the time of the 12 different little towns you're passing through along the way? It wasn't just a couple of different times either. At one point, there were over 50 different railroad times in the United States alone. Some conductors would walk around with pocket watches that had 2 or 3 different sets of hands, just so they could keep track of where they were and where they came from. They were constantly doing subtraction and addition in their heads while trying to keep the engine from exploding. You had stations with 5 different clocks on the wall, and none of them matched. People were missing their rides, freight was getting lost, and the whole system was a mess. See, back then, we didn't have fancy double tracks. Most of the time, there was just one set of rails. If a train was going east and another train was going west, they were on the same piece of metal. The only way they didn't hit each other was by using a very strict schedule. The plan was simple. You go east, I go west. At exactly 1 p.m., you pull over onto a side track and wait for me to pass. Once I'm gone, you pull back onto the main track and keep going. It's a perfect plan, as long as both of our watches say 1 p.m. at the same moment. But they didn't. In 1853, a train was heading through Rhode Island. The conductor looked at his watch and thought he had plenty of time to reach the next siding.
He thought it was 10:15, but his watch was slow. Or maybe he was using the time from the previous station. Either way, he was wrong. On the other side of the curve, another train was coming right at him. That conductor's watch said 10:17. In those 2 minutes, 14 people died. The trains hit head-on. These weren't like car crashes today, where you have airbags and crumple zones. These were giant blocks of iron hitting each other at full speed. The wooden passenger cars behind the engines didn't just break, they shattered. They turned into thousands of wooden spears. And because people used wood stoves to stay warm in the winter, the wrecks almost always caught fire. If the impact didn't get you, the fire did. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. It kept happening. All over the country, trains were slamming into each other because one guy's noon wasn't the other guy's noon. It got so bad that people were terrified to get on a train. They loved the speed, but they didn't like the idea of being impaled because of a math error. The newspapers were full of these stories. People started calling for a change. The sun was too slow. It stayed in one place while we moved underneath it faster than we ever had before. The railroad companies were the ones who really felt the pressure. They were losing money, they were losing equipment, and they were losing the public's trust. They realized they couldn't just keep adding more watches to the conductors' pockets. They had to simplify the entire planet. They had to tell every town in the country that their local clock, the one they had used for generations, the one based on the actual sun in their actual sky, was wrong, or at least it was no longer useful. Think about how big of a deal that is. For all of human history, we looked at the sky to know what time it was. The railroad companies were about to tell people to stop looking up and start looking at a map instead. They were going to draw invisible lines across the earth and tell everyone inside those lines that they had to have the exact same time, whether the sun agreed with them or not. They were about to invent time zones. But people weren't going to give up their local sun time without a fight. To a lot of people, changing the clock felt like lying. It felt like trying to trick nature itself. But the railroads didn't care about nature anymore. They cared about the schedule, and the schedule was written in blood. The era of living by the sun was ending, and the era of the standard was about to begin. We were moving away from the natural world and into a world made of grids and gears. And once we made that switch, there was no going back. The sun was still up there, doing its thing, but for the first time in history, we decided we didn't need it to tell us when the day started.
We had the tracks, and the tracks demanded a new kind of time.
So those tracks were laid down, and the trains were moving, but there was a massive problem that nobody really saw coming. You have to understand that back then, time was a local thing. It was personal. If you lived in a town, your noon was whenever the sun was directly over your head. That was it. That was the rule. But the sun doesn't hit every town at the same time. If you walked 20 miles to the next town over, their noon might be 4 or 5 minutes after yours. It didn't matter when you were walking or riding a horse because you were moving slow. Nobody cared about 5 minutes. But the trains, they cared. They cared a lot. By the 1870s, the map was a total mess. If you were traveling from New York to Chicago, you might have to change your watch 27 times. No joke. Every station had its own clock set to its own sun. You'd get off one train, look at the wall, and realize you were suddenly 10 minutes late for your connection, even though you just got there. It was confusing, sure, but it was also incredibly dangerous. See, these trains were sharing the same tracks.
If a conductor in one train thought it was 12:05 and a conductor coming the other way thought it was 12:10, they were going to have a bad day. They'd be barreling toward each other at top speed, thinking they had plenty of time to pull off onto a side track. Instead, they'd hit each other head on. These crashes were brutal. People were dying, cargo was burning, and the railroad bosses were losing a fortune. The guys running the railroads were practical men. They weren't scientists or philosophers. They were businessmen. They looked at the pile of broken train cars and the angry passengers and decided they'd had enough. They realized they couldn't control the sun, but they could definitely control the clocks. So in 1883, the big bosses from all the major rail lines got together. They didn't ask the government for help. They didn't ask the public what they thought. They just sat down with a map of North America and a bunch of rulers. They drew 4 big vertical lines across the continent. They decided that inside each of these sections, every single person would use the exact same time. It didn't matter where the sun was. It sounds normal to us now, but back then it was a total revolution. They picked a date for the switch, November 18th, 1883. In a lot of cities, the sun reached its highest point. The town clock struck 12, and then, a few minutes later, the railroad officials stepped out and set the clock back to 12 again. It was like they were rewinding the day. A lot of people hated it. They felt like the railroads were playing God. Some preachers even got up in their pulpits and shouted that railroad time was a lie and that God's time, the sun, was the only truth. But money and safety usually win those kinds of fights. If you wanted to get your mail, if you wanted to travel, or if you wanted to do business, you had to follow the railroad. Within a few months, the whole country just kind of gave in. The sun was still up there, but it wasn't the boss anymore. The railroad companies were. But the world was bigger than just America. While the U.S. was figuring out its own mess, the rest of the planet was still a chaotic patchwork. If you were a sailor crossing the Atlantic, you were basically guessing. Every country had its own starting point for its maps. The French used Paris. The British used London. Other countries used whatever city they liked best. It made navigation a nightmare. If everyone is using a different zero on their map, how do you know where you actually are in the middle of the ocean? You don't. You just hope for the best. By 1884, the world had become too small for that kind of nonsense. Telegrams were flying under the sea. Steamships were moving faster than anyone ever imagined. You could send a message to the other side of the planet in an afternoon. But what time was it when the message got there? Nobody could give you a straight answer. See for what they called the International Meridian Conference. I want you to imagine this room. You've got these men with giant beards and stiff collars sitting around these big wooden tables. They were there to slice up the world. Everything would be measured from that one spot. Now, as you can guess, this turned into a bit of a playground fight. The French were very proud of their maps and their history. They wanted the line to go straight through Paris. They argued that it was the center of culture and science. But the British had a different argument. Because the British Navy was the biggest in the world, most sailors were already using British maps, and those maps all started at a small observatory in a place called Greenwich, right on the edge of London. The debate went on for weeks. It was a power struggle disguised as a math problem. But in the end, the British won the vote. They decided that Greenwich would be the center of time, 0 degrees longitude. From that spot, they did exactly what the railroad bosses had done in America, but on a global scale. They sliced the Earth into 24 even pieces. Each piece represented 1 hour of the day. If it was noon in Greenwich, it was 1 p.m. one slice to the east and 11 a.m. one slice to the west. It was incredibly neat. It was logical, it was efficient, and it completely changed how humans existed. For thousands of years, we lived by the rhythm of our own patch of dirt. We woke up when the sun hit our windows. We ate when the sun was high. We slept when it got dark. Our time was tied to the ground we stood on. But after that meeting in 1884, we were tied to a grid. We became part of a global machine. Think about what that did to our brains. Suddenly, you weren't just a person in a village. You were a point on a coordinate system. You were part of a synchronized world. If a man in London looked at his watch, he knew exactly where the hands were on a watch in Tokyo or San Francisco. We had taken the messy, circular, natural world and forced it into a straight line. We didn't just invent a way to track time. We invented a way to own it. We turned the entire planet into one big ticking clock. And once that clock started ticking, there was no way to slow it down.
We had the zones, we had the grid, and we had the master clock in England telling us all when to move. The sun was relegated to a background character. From that point on, if you wanted to know what time it was, you didn't look up. You looked at the wall. You looked at the tracks. You looked at the lines we drew on the map. We were finally in sync, but we had lost something local and natural that we would never get back.
But don't think for a second that people just rolled over and took it. You don't just tell a whole country that their clocks are wrong and expect them to say thank you. For thousands of years, time belonged to the sky. It belonged to the sun. Then, suddenly, a bunch of guys in suits who ran the railroads decided that time belonged to them. They called it standard time. But to the people living in the small towns and the big cities, it felt like a robbery. It felt like someone was trying to break the laws of nature. Think about how you'd feel if the government sent you a letter tomorrow saying that from now on, 2 o'clock is actually 4 o'clock, just because it's easier for some delivery trucks. You'd think they were crazy. That's exactly what happened in 1883. The railroad companies just picked a Sunday in November and decided that would be the day they changed the world. They called it the Day of Two Noons. In some places, the sun hit its highest point, the town clock struck 12, and then a few minutes later, they forced the clock back to 12 again. People were losing their minds. There was this one priest up in Maine. He was an old school guy who didn't care about train schedules. He believed that the sun was God's clock, and who were these railroad bosses to tell God he was wrong? On the first Sunday of the new time, everyone in town expected him to ring the church bell according to the new railroad schedule. He didn't do it. He stood up there and told his congregation that he wouldn't touch that bell based on some man-made lie. He said if the sun hadn't reached the meridian, it wasn't noon, period. He refused to change his life for a machine. And he wasn't the only one. In towns all across the country, mayors were getting into shouting matches with the railroad agents. The mayor of Bangor, Maine, flat out refused to recognize the change. He actually forbid the town's public clocks from being moved. He told the people that the railroad could do whatever it wanted on its tracks, but the town belonged to the people, and the people lived by the sun. For a while, you had this weird situation where the train station said it was 11:30, but the bank down the street said it was 11:55. If you were trying to catch a ride, you had to do math just to figure out when to leave your house. It was a mess. People started getting paranoid. There was this huge fear that the government was trying to steal their daylight. It sounds funny to us now, but they were dead serious. They thought that if you moved the clock, you were somehow shortening the day. Farmers were worried their cows wouldn't produce milk.
Workers thought they were being cheated out of their evening hours. In some cities, things actually turned into full-blown riots. People would gather in the squares and yell at the big clock towers. They'd throw rocks at the glass faces. They saw the new time as a symbol of the big corporations taking over their private lives. It wasn't just about the minutes. It was about who was in charge of their day. In Savannah, Georgia, the city council stayed up late arguing about it for weeks. They finally decided they weren't going to cave. They kept their town on sun time for years after the rest of the country had moved on. You'd walk into a store and see 2 different clocks hanging on the wall. You had to specify which one you were talking about every time you made plans to meet someone for a drink. Can you imagine the headaches? You tell a guy to meet you at the pub at 6, and you end up waiting an hour because you're both using different versions of the truth. There was this sense of pride in sticking to the old ways. People felt like they were defending something sacred. To them, the railroad time was fake. It was artificial. It was a city thing that didn't belong in the country. Writers at the time were mocking the whole idea. They wrote letters to the newspapers saying that the next thing the government would try to do is change the direction the wind blows or tell the moon when to show up. They saw it as the ultimate act of human arrogance. We were trying to boss around the stars. The resistance lasted way longer than you'd think. This wasn't something that got fixed in a weekend. It took decades. Even though the railroads were the most powerful companies in the world, they couldn't force people to change their hearts. People are stubborn. We like our habits. We like the way things have always been. For over 30 years, the United States didn't even have a federal law about time. It was just a gentleman's agreement between the railroads and anyone who felt like following along. It wasn't until 1918, during the First World War, that the government finally stepped in and passed the Standard Time Act. They needed it for the war effort, for moving troops and supplies without any confusion. That's when it became the law of the land. But even then, people fought it. When the war ended, the public was so fed up with the government messing with their clocks that they actually got Congress to repeal the part about daylight saving time. It's crazy to think about how much we take for granted now. You look at your phone and the time is just there. It's perfect. It's the same time for you as it is for the guy 3 states away. We don't even think about it. But for a whole generation of people, this was a fight for their freedom. They didn't want to be cogs in a giant machine. They wanted to wake up when the sun came up and eat when the sun was high, just like their fathers and grandfathers had done since the beginning of history. They eventually lost, of course. The law won. The machines won. We all eventually fell into line because we had to. You can't run a modern world if everyone is living on their own personal version of 12 o'clock. But when those mayors refused to turn the hands of the town clock, and when that priest refused to ring his bell, they were sending a message. They were saying that human beings aren't just parts of a schedule. They were trying to hold on to a world where time was something you felt in your bones, not something you read off a piece of paper. It took 40 years of arguing, protesting, and flat-out ignoring the rules before we finally gave in and accepted that the clock on the wall was the boss of us all. And once that happened, there was no going back.
The sun was still up there, doing its thing, but we stopped looking at it. We started looking at our wrists instead. We were finally in sync, but we were also finally disconnected from the only clock that had ever actually mattered.
So we're all looking at our wrists now. But here's the thing you have to understand. Those early pocket watches, they were kind of a mess. Not broken exactly, just moody. They were mechanical things with tiny gears and springs, and they didn't like the cold, they didn't like being bumped, and they definitely didn't like being carried around all day. They would drift. Your watch might gain 3 minutes by lunch, and mine might lose 5. If you and I were trying to meet up for a drink in London in the mid-1800s, there was almost a 0% chance our watches actually matched. Back then, if you missed your train because your watch was 5 minutes slow, you didn't just wait 10 minutes for the next one. You were just stuck. The world was moving faster, the trains were on a schedule, and the factories were ringing bells, but nobody actually knew what time it was. It was a mess. You had one place, though, that was always right, the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. They had the big, heavy, fancy clocks that they checked against the movement of the stars. But if you're a shopkeeper in the middle of London, you can't exactly close up your shop, hop on a carriage, and spend 3 hours trekking up a hill to Greenwich just to see what time it is. You've got shoes to sell or meat to butcher. You're busy. This is where things get interesting. In 1836, a guy named John Henry Belville worked at that observatory. He looked around and realized that everyone in the city was basically just guessing. He saw a gap in the market. He realized that time wasn't just a measurement anymore, it was a product. So he started a business. He didn't sell watches, he sold the time itself. He had this incredibly high-end pocket watch. It was a silver chronometer made by a famous watchmaker named John Arnold. It was basically the Ferrari of watches at the time. Every single morning, John Henry would go into work at the observatory and set his watch exactly to the master clock. Then he'd get in his carriage or just start walking. He had a list of about 200 customers. He'd go to their shops, their offices, or their homes. He'd knock on the door, they'd pay him a fee, and he'd pull out his watch. They would look at his watch, set it to match it, and he'd move on to the next person. He was a human USB drive for the time. John Henry did this for years. It was a solid, steady living. When he died in 1856, the business didn't stop. His wife, Maria, took over the route. She walked the same streets, knocked on the same doors, and carried that same silver watch. But the real star of the story is their daughter, Ruth Belville. Ruth took over the family business around 1892. By this point, you'd think her job would be obsolete. People had telegraphs. The world was becoming modern. But Ruth was a professional. Every Monday morning, rain or shine, she would get up at her home in the suburbs and make the long trip into the city. She'd go straight to the observatory. She wasn't just a random lady showing up. She was a legacy. The guards knew her. The astronomers knew her. She would walk up to the main clock, pull out that old silver Arnold, the same one her dad had used decades earlier, and she'd check the time. She didn't just eyeball it. She waited for the exact second. Once she was sure, she'd get a signed certificate from the observatory staff. This was her proof. Then she'd head back down the hill and start her route through the heart of London. I want you to imagine this woman. She's not wearing a uniform. She's just a regular-looking lady in a long dress and a hat, carrying a handbag. But inside that handbag is the most important thing in the city. She'd walk miles. She'd go to the big watchmakers first. These were the guys who made the clocks for the wealthy people and the banks. If their clocks were wrong, the whole city's economy could get weird. She'd walk into the shop, the owner would greet her, and she'd pull out the watch. They'd adjust their big pendulum clocks to match hers, pay her the fee, and she'd go to the next stop. She had customers at the docks, customers in the banks, and customers who just liked the tradition of it. She was like a walking heartbeat for the city, and she was fast. She knew the shortcuts. She knew which streets were crowded and which ones were quiet. She did this every single week, year after year. But it wasn't always easy. Around the early 1900s, a guy named St. John Wynne decided he wanted to take her down. He was the director of the Standard Time Company. He sold a service that sent time signals through telegraph wires. To him, Ruth Belville was an embarrassment. He thought it was ridiculous that in the age of electricity, people were still paying a lady to walk around with a pocket watch. He decided to go on the attack. He gave a big speech at a club and got the newspapers to write about it. He basically mocked her. He suggested that she used her feminine charms to get business. He was trying to shame her out of existence so everyone would buy his telegraph service instead. But the plan totally backfired. See, Londoners are a funny bunch. They didn't like this big corporate guy picking on a lady who had been helping them for years. The newspapers started writing about her, but they didn't make fun of her. They turned her into a local hero. Her business actually got better because of the free publicity. People liked the human touch. They trusted a person they could see and talk to, more than a wire in the wall. Ruth didn't let the drama slow her down. She just kept walking. She survived the invention of the radio. She survived the First World War. Even when the BBC started broadcasting the pips, those short 6 tones that tell you it's the top of the hour, Ruth still had her loyal customers. They didn't want the radio. They wanted the Belville watch. Think about the sheer stamina of that. She did this until 1940. By then, she was in her 80s. Imagine that for a second. The world is at war. Planes are flying over London. Modern technology is everywhere. And here is Ruth Belville, still making her way to Greenwich, still checking her dad's old silver watch against the master clock, and still walking the streets to make sure the city's clocks were right. She finally retired because she was simply too old to keep up the walking. She had been doing the job for nearly 50 years. When she stopped, a whole era of human history stopped with her.
She was the last person who literally carried time from one place to another. After her, time became something that lived in the air, in the wires, and eventually in the satellites. We think of time as this invisible thing that just exists everywhere at once. But for a long time, for the people of London, time was a woman in a hat walking down the street with a silver watch in her pocket. If she didn't show up, the day didn't start. When she retired, that personal connection to the clock finally broke. We gained more accuracy, sure, but we lost the person who brought it to us.
So that personal connection was gone. Once that lady with the long stick retired and the local knocker-ups faded away, we weren't waking up to a human voice anymore. We were waking up to a cold, loud machine. And let me tell you, the machines were a whole lot meaner. Back then, if you worked in a factory or a mill, the clock wasn't just a tool to tell you when lunch was. It was a weapon used against you. The guys running the shops realized pretty quickly that time was literally money. If they could squeeze 5 more minutes out of a worker in the morning and 5 more at night, they'd make a massive profit across a whole floor of people. So they cheated. It sounds wild, but factory owners would actually mess with the hands of the big clock on the wall. They'd slow it down during the shift so the day felt shorter than it really was, making you work longer for the same pay. Then they'd speed it up right when it was time to go home, so you'd leave on time according to the clock, even though you'd actually put in an extra hour of labor. Workers weren't stupid, though. They noticed the sun was in a different spot when the clock said it was noon. They started trying to bring their own watches to work just to prove the boss was lying. But the bosses just banned watches. They made it a strict rule. The only time that matters is the one on our wall. That's when things started to get really ugly. This wasn't just about being a few minutes late. It was about who owned your life and your body. It was about whether you were a person or just a part of the engine. The labor unions started to rise up because they were tired of being treated like gears. They had a very simple demand, and they put it on posters and sang it in the streets. They wanted 3 even chunks of 8. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep. That meant hobbies, family, or just sitting on the porch doing absolutely nothing. They fought for years to get that. People actually got into massive brawls and faced down police in the streets just for the right to have a schedule that didn't kill them. Then comes a name you definitely know, Henry Ford. Now, a lot of people think Ford was just a nice guy who wanted to help his workers. That's not really how it went down. Ford was a business genius, but he was also a bit of a control freak. He looked at his assembly lines and saw that his workers were quitting constantly because the work was mind-numbing and the hours were brutal. It was hard to keep the cars moving when half the staff walked out every week. He also realized something else that changed everything. If his workers were always at the factory, they didn't have any time to go out and spend their money. In 1926, Ford made a massive move. He cut the work week down to 5 days and 40 hours. He didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart. Why? Because people with leisure time need to go places. They need to see the sights, visit their family, and go shopping. And to do all those things, they need to buy a car. He turned his workers into his best customers by giving them back their Saturdays.
He realized that the clock could be a tool for selling things, not just for making them. Before that, the weekend didn't really exist as a concept. You had Sunday for church, and that was about it. Suddenly, we had this 2-day gap in the middle of our lives. But there was a catch. This new 3 time was strictly regulated by the same clock that ran the factory. You worked hard for 5 days, then you played hard for 2. The clock was still the boss. It just gave you a little more room to breathe. We built a wall between work life and real life, and the clock was the bricklayer. But to make this whole system work for the next generation, you have to start them young. You can't just take a kid who grew up on a farm where you work when the sun is up and stop when you're tired and throw him into a factory. He'd go crazy. He wouldn't understand why he has to stand in one spot for 10 hours straight. So we changed how we taught our children. We built schools that looked and felt exactly like the factories. Think about your time in school. What's the most important sound in the whole building? It's the bell. The school bell wasn't designed to help kids learn math better or read faster. It was designed to train them for the factory floor. It taught you that when the bell rings, you move. You stop what you're doing, you get up, and you go to the next station. You eat your lunch when the bell tells you to, and you stop eating when it rings again. You can't go to the bathroom until the clock says it's okay. We spent 12 years of our childhood being conditioned to react to a sound. By the time you turned 18, you were perfect for the assembly line. You didn't even think to question the schedule. You were already a part of the machine before you even got your first job. Once you graduated, you traded the school bell for the punch card. This was the ultimate victory for the clock. You walked into a building, took a piece of paper with your name on it,
and stuck it into a heavy metal machine that stamped the exact second you arrived. If you were 2 minutes late, they took your money. If you left a minute early, they took your money. Your value as a human being was tied directly to those blue and red ink stamps on a card. The punch card didn't care if you were tired, or if your kid was sick, or if you had a great idea. It only cared if you were there when the gears were turning. We ended up in this weird loop that we haven't escaped. We used the clock to organize our work so we could be more productive. That productivity made us rich, and it gave us all the gadgets and cars we wanted. But then we used that same clock to organize our fun. We started scheduling play dates for our kids. We started making reservations for dinner weeks in advance. The person who used to bring the time to your door was gone, replaced by a system that never sleeps and never misses a beat. We stopped living by the seasons or the sun or how we actually felt inside. We started living by the numbers on a screen. And once we started doing that, there was no going back.
We didn't just use the clock to tell us what time it was. We let the clock tell us who we were. We became the first species in history that would rather be on time than be happy. We're still living in Henry Ford's world, waiting for that bell to ring so we can finally go home and spend the time we spent our whole day trying to save.
But the thing about Henry Ford's world was that it still relied on stuff we could actually see. We had gears, we had pendulums, and we had the rotation of the Earth. For a long time, we thought the Earth was the perfect clock. It spins, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, and we call that a day. But as we started getting more technical, we realized the Earth is actually a pretty lousy timekeeper. It wobbles. It slows down when there's a big earthquake or when the tides shift. For most of history, that didn't matter. If the day was a tiny bit longer, nobody noticed. But then, in the 1940s, scientists started getting really picky. They wanted to measure things that happen way faster than a human blink. They realized that if we wanted to be truly precise, we had to stop looking at the sky and start looking at the basement of reality. A scientist named Isidore Rabi had a wild idea. He figured out that atoms are the most reliable things in the universe. They don't care about the weather, they don't care about the moon, and they don't get tired. Specifically, he and his team looked at an element called cesium. Think of an atom like a tiny invisible tuning fork. If you hit a cesium atom with the right kind of energy, it vibrates. It jumps back and forth at a speed that never changes. It is the same yesterday, today, and a million years from now. By 1955, two guys in England named Louis Essen and Jack Parry actually built the machine to prove it. This wasn't a watch you could wear on your wrist. It looked like a giant, messy pile of plumbing and wires in a laboratory. But inside that pipe, they were bouncing atoms. They found out that a cesium atom ticks exactly 9,192,631,770 times every single second. That became the new law of the land. In 1967, the world officially changed the definition of time. We stopped saying a second was a fraction of a day and started saying a second was just how long it takes that atom to wobble 9 billion times. Once we had that kind of precision, the military got very interested. They realized that if you know exactly what time it is, you can figure out exactly where you are. The U.S. Air Force started launching satellites into space. They called it the Global Positioning System, or GPS.
Today, we use it to find the nearest pizza place, but it's really just a giant network of atomic clocks flying over our heads at thousands of miles per hour. Here's how it works. Each satellite has an atomic clock inside it, all synced up perfectly. When your phone wants to know where you are, it's not measuring distance with a tape measure. It's measuring time. It listens for a signal from the satellite. Beep! Your phone looks at its own clock and sees that it received the message a tiny fraction of a second later. Because we know how fast radio waves travel, we can do the math to see how far away the satellite is. If you do that with 4 different satellites at the same time, you can pinpoint your location down to the inch. But if those clocks were off by even 1,000th of a second, your GPS would think you were in the next state. While the military was busy mapping the world, the business world was figuring out how to turn those nanoseconds into cold, hard cash. This is where things started to get a little bit crazy. In the old days, the stock market was a place where guys in suits stood in a room and screamed at each other. They waved paper tickets around and made deals by making eye contact. That was human speed. But once we hooked our computers up to atomic clocks and high-speed internet, the humans became the slowest part of the equation. Today, the stock market doesn't really happen on a floor in New York. It happens in giant windowless warehouses in places like New Jersey and Chicago. These buildings are packed with thousands of computer servers humming away in the dark. These computers are programmed to buy and sell stocks in microseconds. A microsecond is 1/1,000,000th of a second. To give you an idea of how fast that is, it takes you about 300,000 microseconds just to blink your eyes once. In the time it takes you to start a blink and finish it, these computers have made thousands of trades and moved millions of dollars. This created a literal arms race for time. Banks and trading firms realized that being faster than the other guy by even a tiny bit meant they could make more money. There was a company called Spread Networks that spent $300 million just to dig a hole. They didn't dig for gold or oil. They dug a trench in a straight line from Chicago to New Jersey. They went through mountains and under rivers just so they could lay a fiber optic cable that was a few miles shorter than the existing ones. They did all that work just to shave 3 milliseconds off the time it took for a signal to travel between the two cities. 3,000ths of a second was worth $300 million. We've reached a point where the world is moving so fast that we can't even see it happening. We have built a system where computers talk to other computers, making decisions and spending money at speeds that defy human logic. If a stock market crashes today, it can happen and recover before a human trader even has time to reach for their coffee mug. They are glitches in a world where time has been sliced so thin that it doesn't even feel like time anymore. Think about what that does to us. We spent thousands of years just trying to keep track of the sun so we knew when to plant wheat. Then we built mechanical clocks so we could run trains and show up for work at the factory. We thought we were winning. We thought we were mastering time. But now the clock has left us behind. We are the slow ones now. We're just passengers on a machine that operates in the gaps between our heartbeats. We use these atomic clocks to sync our phones, our power grids, and our bank accounts. Our entire civilization is now held together by the vibration of an atom that we can't see and a signal from a satellite that we can't touch. We've moved from the rhythm of the seasons to the rhythm of the machine. We've gained incredible precision, and we've gained world-changing technology. Every second is now a billion little pieces, and every one of those pieces is being used by something that isn't us.
We wanted to own time, but it feels like time ended up owning the world, and we're just trying to keep up.
We really did get owned by it. We stopped listening to what our bodies actually wanted and started listening to a piece of ticking metal on the wall. And if you think about it, the biggest way the clock messed with us is sitting right in your bedroom. I'm talking about your bed. Most of us think that sleeping for 8 hours straight is just what humans do. We think if we wake up at 3 a.m. and can't get back to sleep for an hour, something is wrong with us. We call it insomnia. We buy expensive pillows or take pills to fix it. But here's the thing. For almost all of human history, that 3 a.m. wake-up call wasn't a problem. It was the plan. Back before every street corner had a lamp, your life was governed by the sun. When it got dark, you went to bed. It was that simple. But you didn't stay there for 8 hours. You would sleep for maybe 4 hours, and then around midnight you would just wake up. You wouldn't be tired or groggy. You would be wide awake and alert. Historians found old journals and medical books from hundreds of years ago that talk about this all the time. They called it your first sleep. And that gap in the middle, that was the most important hour of the night. Think about what you do when you can't sleep now. You probably scroll on your phone and feel stressed about how tired you're going to be tomorrow. You look at the clock and do the math on how much sleep you're losing. But back then, nobody was stressed. They expected to be awake. People would get out of bed and actually do stuff. Some people stayed under the covers and just talked to their partners. It was the best time for a real conversation because the kids were asleep and the world was dead quiet. Others would get up and do chores. They would mend clothes by candlelight or stir the fire to keep the house warm. Some people even walked over to their neighbor's house for a quick drink or a chat. It was a social hour in the middle of the night. Then, after about an hour, they would feel that heaviness hit their eyes again. They would crawl back in for their second sleep and stay there until the sun came up. So what changed? How did we lose that middle hour? Well, we killed it with light. First came the gas lamps in the 1700s, and then the electric light bulb. Suddenly, the night wasn't scary or useless anymore. It was a place where you could actually do things. Business owners realized they could keep shops open later. Cities realized they could have a nightlife. We started pushing our bedtime back further and further. Instead of going to bed at 8 p.m. when the sun went down, we stayed up until 10 or 11. But here's the catch. Even though we were staying up later, we still had to get up at the same time for work. The Industrial Revolution didn't care about your second sleep. Factories needed workers on a strict schedule. You couldn't just show up whenever you finished your morning nap. You had to be there when the whistle blew. So we did something pretty drastic to our own biology. We squeezed those two separate sleeps together. We forced our bodies to do the whole thing in one big block.
We invented the alarm clock to make sure we didn't slip back into our old habits. We basically told our brains to shut up and get in line with the factory clock. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the idea of 2 sleeps was almost totally forgotten. It happened so fast that we forgot it was ever the normal way to live. Doctors started seeing people who woke up in the middle of the night and they didn't know what to tell them. They started treating it like a medical disorder or a brain problem. But it isn't a disorder. It is just your body remembering how it lived for thousands of years. Your DNA is still waiting for that midnight hour that the modern world deleted. We traded that quiet midnight peace for productivity. We gave up that time where nothing was expected of us just so we could fit better into a machine. Now we spend our lives trying to force that solid 8-hour block.
If we wake up, we panic. We look at the clock and calculate the damage. We have turned sleep into a job we are failing at. And the worst part is, we don't even realize we're missing something that used to be a basic part of being a human being. We aren't broken. We are just living in a world that doesn't let us sleep the way we were built to. We've traded our natural rhythm for a punch card, and we've been tired ever since. So, we're tired. We're exhausted because we're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole every single day. We're fighting against millions of years of history every time we set an alarm on our phones. It feels like we're broken, but we aren't. We just weren't built for this. Think about how it all started. It was so simple back then. We didn't have minutes or seconds. We just had the sun. We looked at a shadow on a rock. That was the first clock. But it wasn't a boss. It was just a tool, kind of like a spear or a basket. If the shadow was long in the morning, you knew it was time to start moving. If it was long in the evening, you knew it was time to find a safe place to sleep. The shadow didn't yell at you if you were 5 minutes late. It didn't make you feel guilty for taking a nap. It just existed. We used time as a suggestion, not a law. Then things started to change because we got better at surviving. We started planting seeds. Now you can't just wing it when you're growing wheat or corn. You have to know when the rain is coming. You have to know when the first frost is going to hit and kill all your hard work. So we started looking at the bigger picture. We watched the stars move across the sky. We tracked the moon. We started carving marks into old booms and flat stones to keep track of the days. We were trying to organize our survival, and it worked. We grew more food. We built bigger villages. We were winning the game of life. But then we got a little too good at it. We stopped looking at the sky and started looking at machines. We built these huge towers in the middle of our towns. They had massive bells in them that would scream at everyone every hour. That was the beginning of the end for our natural rhythm. Suddenly, it didn't matter if you were actually hungry. It only mattered if the bells said it was lunchtime. It didn't matter if you were still sleepy. If the bell rang, you had to be up. We took time out of the woods and the fields, and we put it into a box. We thought that by putting it in a box, we could control it. We thought we were the masters of the day. The real shift happened when we stopped being farmers and started being parts in a giant machine. When the factories showed up, the world changed forever. A factory boss didn't care about your internal clock. He didn't care if you were a night owl or a morning person. He cared that you were standing at your station the exact moment the steam whistle blew. If you were 10 minutes late, you didn't get paid. If you didn't get paid, you didn't eat. That's when the clock stopped being a helpful tool and started being a whip. We started carrying that whip in our pockets. We made pocket watches so we could check the time every few minutes just to make sure we weren't falling behind. Then we strapped those watches to our wrists so we didn't even have to reach into our pockets anymore. We wanted to make sure we didn't miss a single second of the time we were supposed to be using to be productive. We became obsessed with efficiency. We started treating ourselves like engines that were never supposed to cool down. And now we've taken it to a level that would make our ancestors think we were crazy. We don't just have clocks on our wrists. We have computers that track our every move. They track our heartbeats while we sleep. They tell us we didn't get enough deep sleep last night, which just makes us more stressed out when we try to sleep the next night. We're wearing gadgets that tell us to stand up, to breathe, to walk more, to do more. We've turned our own bodies into data points on a screen. We went from being people who lived through the day to being managers of our own minutes. We built this massive, complicated system to help us get organized. We thought it would give us more freedom. We thought that if we mastered time, we'd finally have enough of it to just relax. But look at us. We're more rushed than we've ever been. We're more anxious about the passing seconds than any human who came before us. We created a world where everything is measured, but nothing feels like it's enough. We built the machine to serve us, but somewhere along the line, the roles flipped. Now we're the ones keeping the machine running. We're the ones jumping when the phone pings. We're the ones feeling like failures if we aren't busy every waking hour. We traded that old, slow rhythm for a digital tick that never stops. We built the cage, we walked inside, and we're the ones who keep winding the key. We invented time to help us grow our food, and now time is the very thing that's eating us alive.